Welcome, and thanks for joining us for today's program, History at High Noon, Montford, Boom to Bust and Back. My name is Stacy, and I handle adult education here at the North Carolina Museum of History. If you enjoyed today's program, we invite you to head over to the museum's website at ncmuseumofhistory.org, where you can learn more about our upcoming programs, exhibits, and digital resources. This is also where you can find more information about shopping in our wonderful museum shop and joining our North Carolina Museum of History Associates. Our associates and foundation provide crucial funding and support to the museum, which, in addition to many other things, helps make programming like today's event possible. A few quick housekeeping items for today. Please keep your mics muted throughout the program, and please type any questions that you have for our guest speaker into the chat function located at the bottom center of your screen. At the end of the program, our adult programs intern Destiny will ask our speaker as many of your questions as time allows. So it's my honor to introduce and welcome back Sharon Fahrer, historian, author, and co-founder of History at Hand. Sharon moved to Asheville in 1996, partly because of its rich history and architecture. People drawn to Asheville often reinvent themselves. She is a recovered environmental planner turned history geek, armed with a BA in geography from Clark University and a master's of urban planning from Wayne State University. She began to document Asheville's Jewish history with Jan Schockett in 2003 to capture the memories of people who knew Asheville's downtown in its prime and to better understand her adopted home. History at Hand has grown to offer walking tours and provide interpretive panels for buildings and outside exhibits. To date, she has authored over 40 panels on a wide array of topics, including Black and Montford history, as well as important sites and people of local history. She has done extensive work enhancing an archive on Jewish life in Western North Carolina at the D. Ramsey Library Special Collections at the University of North Carolina at Asheville. She chaired the 37th annual meeting of the Southern Jewish Historical Society in Asheville and currently serves on the board of Jewish Heritage North Carolina, as well as on the research committee of the Community Remembrance Project. Jan Schockett and Sharon co-wrote two books, The Family Store, A History of Jewish Businesses in Asheville, North Carolina, 1880 to 1990, and The Man Who Lived on Main Street, Stories by and about Saul Schulman. Sharon also wrote A Home in Shalomville, A History of Asheville's Jewish Community. So Sharon, I'm going to turn things over to you. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Stacy, and thanks for having me back again. I'm excited about this presentation. Full disclosure, I lived in Montford for 25 years, and it was one of the things that drew us to Asheville to have so many great historic districts. So I tried to look at, what really shaped this neighborhood and how did it go from a pretty affluent neighborhood to, very downhill, and then now it's come back again. So I hope this is my attempt at trying to explain that every neighborhood has a life cycle, just like people do. And these first three pictures are all the same house in different time periods. I don't have an original picture of 1895, but that's my best guess is that it looked pretty similar to how it looks in the right-hand picture. By the 40s and the 50s, someone decided that it ought to be more arts and crafts style, and they changed the columns and things like that. And then as the neighborhood deteriorated, it became a rooming house, house of ill repute, things like that. And that's what it looked like in 1990, the middle picture. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Montford, since I can't ask you, I'm going to have to explain it. So on your left is a map of Montford, and it's a very distinct neighborhood. You're in it or you're out of it. There's no questions. Down at the bottom here to the south, that is downtown Asheville. It's separated from downtown by I-240. And the other border is 1923, future 26, whatever they're calling it. And then on the right-hand side is Broadway. So there are different sections of Montford. The inside this dotted line, and I apologize because it's hard to tell the difference in the colors, but this dotted line here is all in the historic district. And you'll see here is Stumptown, which we'll be talking about more in a minute, and Riverside Cemetery. Here is a graph of the amount of building that went on in Montford. It doesn't show recently because there's definitely been a surge in that. But here you can see that it was, a lot of it was done in the 20s. And Montford is a snapshot in time of a specific time period. That's what historic districts are about. And so it's 1890 to 1925 is the period of the historic district. I'll just mention a couple of other things. The oldest house in Montford is down here, and it's from 1848. It was more like a plantation house, and it had 75 acres and a livery stable and things like that. Montford is a very diverse neighborhood economically, and there are two housing projects. Over here on the left is Hillcrest, and up here is Klondike, and we'll be talking specifically about them a little bit too. Now on the bottom here is a Google map from 1912. These maps were done periodically, and someone actually drew all the houses. You can see that Montford is almost along the French Broad River, and down here was a park, which was called Riverside Park. And Montford was an early trolley suburb, and the trolley would take people down Montford Avenue, which no longer connects to this, but to this park. That was a way for the trolley company to get ridership. But this park was lost in the Great Flood of 1916. So it hasn't existed for a long time. Here is Riverside Cemetery, you can see. So Montford was incorporated as a town in 1893, and it was annexed by the City of Asheville in 1905. Let me see if I skipped something. So how did it get its name? Well, there were all sorts of theories about it, and there are other places with the name Montford in the state of North Carolina. But we attribute it now to a guy named Richmond Pearson, who he had been an attaché to Greece and Montenegro and Persia, and he retired in Asheville, and it was a derivative of his family's name, which was Montford, which is a French English word. And he agreed, well, if they agreed to name it Montford, then he agreed to pay for a railroad station in a part of it called Montford Park, which is no longer in Montford. So in 1890, also the main street, which was called Academy Street, was changed to Montford Avenue. In the 1920s, there was a section that was developed. It's not in the historic district. It's called Montford Hills, and it was advertised as a suburb in the city, but it included racial covenants prohibiting the sale of land to Negroes. So just to give you a little bit of perspective on Montford, it was originally inhabited by the ancestors of the Cherokee. Then some wealthy families bought huge tracts of land, and some of them are in Montford. The one and only battle in Asheville during the Civil War took place along the right-hand border of Asheville. It was called the Battle of Asheville. And there was also a Confederate camp in the lower section, which would be sort of near downtown now, that was called Camp Jeter. Well, in 1890, the Asheville Loan Construction and Improvement Company purchased 1,000 acres of land to subdivide into residential lots. And they had plans to put lakes and parks and streets with electric cars running through. 300 acres of that property is still what we call Montford. Well, by 1883, they'd installed a lot of the things they said they were going to install, but land wasn't selling so well. There was a depression in 1893, and they went bankrupt. The same year, the area was incorporated as Montford, and James Rumbaugh was its one and only mayor. James Rumbaugh had the distinction of being the first man to drive an automobile over the Appalachian Mountains. So on your left here is an original plat map for Montford, the section that we're talking about. Once it went bankrupt, a guy named George Willis Pack purchased the development from the courthouse steps, and he began to bundle lots and make a lot of sales. He also sold off the part of Montford that was on the other side of the French Broad River. So, oops, sorry. Let me see. So now Stumptown, I mentioned to you, this was a Black enclave in the middle of Montford. So African Americans were always part of the Montford neighborhood. And in 1871, Nicholas Woodfin gave his former slave, Tempe Avery, land, and this is a picture of Tempe here, which was exactly where today there's a Montford Recreation Center, and it's called the Tempe Avery Center. So this vibrant Stumptown community developed around Tempe's home, and it wasn't the only Black population in Montford. There were also side streets that were specifically African American. Many of the people in those side streets owned their own homes, not so much in Stumptown. Stumptown was very poor. You can see the quality of the homes, not too well built. And this picture is actually from the 60s. So you still had some pretty rough conditions there. Not far from Stumptown was the Hill Street School, which was an early school for Negroes down here on Hill Street. And it was totally inadequate. So by 1914, they built a larger building, but it was still inferior to the white schools. Apparently, people in Montford were afraid that if Blacks got too well educated, they wouldn't be domestics and work for them anymore. So there was a pretty big backlash, but they did get a bigger school. And also down here was Dr. William Green Torrance's hospital. It was the first hospital for Blacks in Asheville. By the 1960s, there was an influx of African Americans to Montford as urban renewal eliminated their neighborhoods. And Eventually, they eliminated Stumptown also, but we'll get to that in a minute. So some of those were able to purchase their own homes. And then others who couldn't purchase homes were put into Klondike and Hillcrest, which were those city projects that I pointed out to you before. Now, also in Montford is Riverside Cemetery, and it was started in 1885 by a group of investors, and it was created as a Victorian rural garden cemetery. And it wasn't only meant to be a modern cemetery, because the precursor to this were very crowded cemeteries where the gravestones were, you know, all in a row and that sort of thing. But they also wanted a park-like atmosphere to bring tourists. And they claimed that Riverside was the city's largest and most beautiful park. So it was laid out in 5 tiers, and the first 4 were for white Christians. The 5th was for African Americans and paupers. And there was a separate entrance for that level. And then it was further divided into sections: 32 for white people, 8 for African Americans, 2 for paupers, and 3 for Beth Hatfila's Jewish congregation, which they purchased in 1891. And the men and youth in Stumptown often provided the labor for digging graves and landscape maintenance. So who actually lived in Montford besides the African American community? Well, they were as cabins and castles, which is an authoritative book on the architecture of Asheville, said that Montford was a neighborhood of homes of conservative, successful people of means, whose own tastes were perhaps unadventurous, but whose vernacular suburbs nonetheless mirrored in subtle ways Asheville's remarkable cosmopolitan character. Now, what they're referring to, there is a great collection of different types of architecture, from arts and crafts, from Victorian, and then vernacular, which were combinations of different styles. So again, the historic district is a snapshot in time from 1890 to 1925. Now, so when did Asheville start to decline? So these white residents were doctors, lawyers, business owners, retired people, people from out of town. Not everybody who owned land was from Montford. It was from Asheville, in fact. They came from all over. So I would say that Montford began to decline with the Great Depression in 1929, because during the Depression, people defaulted, and so some homes went to the bank, and then larger homes became boarding houses and apartments. They were chopped up. And then in 1937 came redlining, which was the Federal Homeowners Loan Corporation creation of residential security maps for major American cities. And on your right here is the map of Montford. And you can see clearly they didn't think too much of it. Red was totally ineligible for any kind of loans. A yellow area was declining. A blue area could be desirable, but the best area was the green area, which isn't even near Montford. So in the 50s, Asheville's Urban Renewal Commission was established, and a year later, the Metropolitan Planning Board. And this started the ball rolling for the demolition of neighborhoods, blighted, what they considered blighted neighborhoods. And on November 20th, 1959, Leonard Thompson of 72 Hill Street, and Hill Street was that street that I showed you that had the hospital and the school, the Black school, received the first certificate for housing relocation under the renewal program. And in the 50s, additional houses, churches, and businesses were demolished or burned down for the Crosstown Expressway, which is now known as I-240. And in the 60s and the 70s, homes were abandoned, they were vandalized, even the fire department burned them down for practice, and Montford became seriously blighted. A lot of the white residents moved to the suburbs or to Biltmore Forest. So from, I'd say, the 60s to the mid 70s, even the city moved anything that was undesirable into the neighborhood. There were homes for recovering alcoholics, recovered drug-addicted mothers and their children, the Baptist Home for Unwed Mothers, an AIDS house, and the Klondike Public Housing Apartments opened in 1974. So by the 70s, Stumptown was all but demolished in part of Asheville's urban renewal program. And streets, but there were streets with historic African-American home ownership that did remain in other parts of Montford. And then there was a proposal to turn Montford Avenue into a through street connecting I-240 to US 1923, which would have devastated the neighborhood. Montford Avenue is the main artery of the neighborhood. And gradually, crime increased. There was drugs and prostitution and even murder. When we moved to Montford in 1996, I remember walking home from downtown, and I couldn't understand why this guy in a pickup truck kept honking at me and circling the block. And it finally dawned on me why he was doing that. I wasn't prepared for that, really. But and later, even in 1995, Broadway Street was expanded by the DOT, and that took down more homes. So Broadway is an artery between I-240 and 1923. So on the left here, I love this picture, is a family watching as they're building I-240. And these two maps show how much of the neighborhood at that time was demolished for the expressway. These are the very south end of Montford, and on the other side is downtown. This is, if anybody's familiar with Asheville, this is St. Lawrence Basilica here. And this is to the right of Montford Avenue, and this is to the left of Montford Avenue. But there were signs of revival. And in 1938, Flint Street residents, concerned about the construction of a commercial garage in their neighborhood, urged the city to adopt a zoning ordinance. Well, they did adopt a zoning ordinance. However, it was not helpful to this facility that today it belongs to the telephone company. Well, in 1969, the Montford Community Club got stronger, and they brought the entire neighborhood together to combat the crime. They had a newsletter, which is still published today, and it was a means of communication for the whole neighborhood. It was delivered, hand-delivered by neighbors. So the idea was you would see your neighbors when you're delivering the newsletter. People were able to buy inexpensive homes and use sweat equity. And this was an important thing too. that everybody really had a stake in making the neighborhood safer and the houses in better condition, saving the houses. And there was a great sense of community. Not only was there a newsletter, but they developed a logo, and there's banners with the logo still on houses today, and community events to bring the neighborhood together. In 1973, the Montford Park Players were founded by Hazel Robinson, and they held their early performances in Montford Park. They're a Shakespeare company, and in 1988, an amphitheater was built where Stumptown had been, in part of Stumptown, and today they still give Shakespeare plays. They still do Shakespeare plays all summer long in this outside amphitheater on Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays. And in 1978, the Montford Recreation Center, which is today the Tempe Avery Montford Center, was dedicated. And it was the fulfillment of the dreams of the neighborhood with the leadership of Orlean Simmons, who was a Model Cities Commissioner and worked for the City of Asheville Parks and Rec at the Montford Center. And a lot of the impetus for this was organized by the people of Stumptown. Stumptown was a neighborhood where everybody watched out for each other, that there was a lot of community feeling within the community. And even today, some of the descendants who grew up in Stumptown and their children have gatherings to talk about how wonderful it was in Stumptown. And you can see some of these online. So other things were happening too. There was a building of momentum. Momentum was building, and it started with the 1966 National Preservation Act. That was a federal government grant program for properties listed in the National Register of Historic Places. And it led the way for federal and state tax credits for first income producing properties, and then included homeowners. And this was a big boost to Montford. Actually, in the beginning, they gave grants to people. It wasn't even a tax credit, but later it became like a tax rebate sort of thing. You got 30 cents for every dollar that you spent renovating your house, you know, putting in new heating systems and things like that, as long as you didn't delete any of the historic elements, architectural elements. So then from 1965 to 1974, Montford was included in the federal Model Cities program, which was funding meant to fight the war on poverty. Stumptown leaders had protested insufficient sanitation services in their neighborhood as compared to other parts of the city. Some of the streets weren't paved. They were sadly lacking in upgrades. And then in 1976, the bicentennial renewed interest in historic preservation. Suddenly people were realizing that if we want to honor our history, we have to preserve these places that are our history. And Montford, 1977, became listed in the National Register of Historic Places, making it eligible for things like federal and state tax credits. And in 1981, the Asheville City Council designated part of Montford as a local historic district. Now, this was a good and bad thing because it divided the neighborhood into the people who lived in the historic district and the people who didn't, which were mostly on the fringes of like Broadway and also Stumptown, things like that. So they formed an organization called the Montford Resource Center. And I'm going to get back to that in a second. Also in the 1980s, bed and breakfast started to appear, and they helped to stabilize the neighborhood. They were using these big houses, which, you know, families were abandoning. They wanted to live in modern houses in the suburbs. So they weren't interested in having big drafty houses with lots of bedrooms. Oops, sorry. And so that was a big boost to the neighborhood. Today we have 11 bed and breakfasts. So it's a wonderful place to stay if you're visiting Asheville. And there's a big variety of architectural styles and things like that. And also in 1988, the city council signed a contract with the Neighborhood Reinvestment Corporation which led to the organization of Neighborhood Housing Services, which was meant to revitalize Montford. It was an organization consisting of neighborhood residents and government officials and business leaders to loan money to people to fix their houses and to build some affordable housing in the neighborhood. In the 90s, the police department, remember I told you there was a resource center, so it was Historic Montford and the Resource Center. The police opened a resource center substation on Montford Avenue. And that brought a police presence to the neighborhood. The other thing that happened was Montford was actually the first neighborhood to fight having a liquor license. There was a convenience store and they sold single bottles of alcohol, and it was causing a lot of problems in the neighborhood. So the neighborhood had bake sales and they raised money and they hired attorneys and they went to Raleigh, and it was the first time that the alcohol whatever you call them department reneged, took away a liquor license from a convenience store. So that was a big help too. And so the trouble with the neighborhood housing services, from people that were on the board, said they didn't have enough local control, and also they didn't put covenants on the affordable houses that they built. So when people sold them, they went for market rates, which meant they were no longer affordable. So maybe that was a plus and a minus there. So also in 1976, the Preservation Society of Asheville and Buncombe County was founded. This was, again, sparked by that bicentennial. And they saw all these threats to local buildings and sites that were neglected, and there was insensitive alterations that, didn't keep with the time period, and these large-scale transportation projects, including the one to make Montford a thoroughfare, and the building of 240. Also, the Preservation Society convinced the North Carolina Department of Cultural Resources to open a Western office in Asheville, which we still have. And this introduced professional preservation services to the region. So there were people to ask, how do I renovate my house? Or they were also the stewards of the tax credit program. So if you were going to restore your house interior wise, you listed your projects and they approved or disapproved of them in keeping, to make you eligible for the tax credits or not. And also they advocated to city council and county commissioners, Buncombe County commissioners, to establish a joint city council local landmark and historic district commission. We call this the Historic Resources Commission. And Montford became its first local historic district. So first it became a National Register district, which meant they did an inventory of all the contributing structures to the local district. And the designation of a local historic district added more protections to the neighborhood, meaning there were guidelines of what you could or couldn't do to the exterior of your house. Now, it didn't include the interior of your house, but if you wanted tax credits, then you applied to the Department of Natural Cultural Resources to have those approved or to help you, do appropriate things. So these actions made possible the historic designation of numerous sites and districts, and for instance, contributed to downtown's revitalization and the preservation of historic places county-wide. Now, another thing that happened was on your right here was the Coleman House, and it sat at the foot of Montford, where today there's a visitor center. And the owner wanted to make it into a restaurant, and he was working with the Preservation Society in the city, and he lost patience. And in the middle of the night, a wrecking ball came and took this house down. And that made the Preservation Society realize that in order to really protect properties, they needed to buy them and to own them until a proper steward could be found. And they established a revolving fund. And over here on the left is the Gudger House, which was their first restoration project. And it still exists today. It's a lawyer's office. And prior to that, it was Pisgah Legal Services, which provides legal aid, mostly for housing, for people who can't afford legal advice. So, there's always the question, Montford's gentrifying, what do you do? Rehabbed houses bring higher prices. The neighborhood's desirable because now everybody wants to live near the center of the city. They want to be walkable to downtown. Here's a neighborhood of diversity. And it was always an economically diverse neighborhood because there were, large houses, smaller houses, 2 housing projects, and everybody in between, single people, older people, and the B&Bs. And organizations like the Preservation Society and Neighborhood Housing Services and the Asheville Housing Authority supported Montford, adding protections and trying to preserve the fabric. People coming together made a difference. And Montford was one of the first neighborhoods in Asheville to organize into a neighborhood association. It was kind of the role model of neighborhood organizations because they saw the value of creating a communications network and having the neighborhood come together for various, celebrations or whatever. And in 2004, eventually the Montford Resource Center and the Montford Historic District merged into the Montford Neighborhood Association. And in 2004, this neighborhood association became a nonprofit. And today it sponsors events and raises funds for neighborhood improvement projects, such as they've refurbished the playground at Klondike. They've donated funds to the Tempe Avery Recreation Center for kids who can't afford to participate in some of the programs like basketball and things like that. And we've created the Montford Museum Without Walls. And on the right here, you see an example of it. All along Montford Avenue, you can walk down and you can see different panels about the history of the neighborhood. This one is about people of Montford, and down here are the people of Stumptown. And so you can get a sense of the history, both visitors, because we have over 250 beds in the bed and breakfasts, and people who go to there's a restaurant across the street, 9 Mile restaurant, you know, they can learn about the history of Montford, and we call this our Montford Museum Without Walls. And there's 7 panels going down the street. And this particular bus shelter was designed to look more historic. It's not your, you know, standard model of a bus shelter. So residents continued to get involved in issues that affect the neighborhood. There was a big, at one point, there was the head of Montford redevelopment, which turned out to be several businesses with apartments above them. The new Asheville Chamber Visitor Center, the development of Broadway. There's private university dorms right at the top of Montford near Klondike. There's always an issue. There's always chipping away at the historic district. And so, you know, it's a never-ending process. So then I thought about here some of the challenges that Montford faces today. Preserving the diversity. Airbnbs, there's a slew of Airbnbs, and they're owned, some of them are owned by non-resident investors who have no attachment to the neighborhood. Now there are rules. If it's an Airbnb, they can't rent it out for less than 30 days. If you, but you can have a homestay. If you're living in your house, you can rent out rooms. There's also just overdevelopment and imbalance of short-term renters. So that's what that leads to. There's a lot of division of some of the larger lots, which are causing loss to the fabric of the neighborhood. Every little cranny you look at, they're building a new house. There's increased traffic and speeding down particularly the wider streets like Montford Avenue, which is equivalent, has parking on both sides and then lane one each way in the middle, because when it was a trolley street, you had the trolley going down the middle of the street with 2 lanes. So it was always a wide street. And people move there, you know, with a disconnect to Montford's history. They live in a new house, or they want to change the historic house. They want, you know, master suites and swimming pools and stuff. And it just, you know, isn't necessarily the hope of the neighborhood that, you know, things are going to change like that. Also, the question of reparations for the taking of land and homes, and how do we make a land trust, perhaps, or different things that could be done for that. The Historic Resources Commission got 14 commissioners on it. Some are appointed by the city and some are appointed by the county. And this leads to a lot of inconsistency of decisions. So you'll see a new house that looks exactly, you wouldn't even know it's a new house. And then you'll see a new house that was dropped from the land of Oz. You know, you have no idea how that fits into the neighborhood. We're working on connecting Montford to the French Broad River Greenway, the Wilma Dykeman Greenway, and that's an ongoing project. And, how do you keep busy residents engaged in organizing and planning neighborhood activities? We had a music festival, we have a tour of homes, we have a garden tour. You need engaged people to work on those things. But in the end, we invite you to visit montford.org to see what's currently happening, and we hope you will visit Montford. So thank you for listening. I appreciate that, and I'm looking forward to some of your questions. Not exactly.
Alrighty, then I can go ahead and start with a few of the questions we have in the chat.
Can you tell me before we get back to that, how I get myself back on the screen here?
Oh, you're gonna go ahead and that green,
Oh, I could just put stop sharing, right?
exactly. Yep. Just stop sharing, you'll be good.
Okay.
There we go. First question comes from Fredlin. Do you know what the current racial makeup is of Montford? Or the socioeconomic makeup, considering what you were talking about in earlier slides.
Okay, the quick answer to that is I don't, but I can see what's happening. And what's happening is older people, older African-American people are, either passing on or moving, and there isn't an influx of younger African-American people. So there's much more of an imbalance than there was.
So in
But
connection,
I think the census statistics would probably answer that question.
well, in connection to that, we have a question from Noel. What happened to the people who were displaced when gentrification took place? Was there any rehousing assistance available for those displaced?
Well, it was a gradual, the Stumptown people, if they owned their house, they got the, city paid the money, not an adequate amount of money. But, and I can only, make a generalization. I can't, because some of the people that lived on the south side or other neighborhoods that were demolished did buy homes in Montford. But it's sort of a gradual attrition thing. It's as far as the neighborhood as a whole. We're not talking about Stumptown, but as far as the neighborhood of a whole, it's just a gradual attrition. And like I said, there aren't, younger African-American people. The people that are there have lived there, some since the 40s, some since, a long time.
Well, you mentioned something about Stumptown just now. We have someone named Benjamin in the chat that just said, Sharon will be pleased to know that Stumptown reunion just occurred recently at the Temple Avery Community Center, and it was well attended.
Good.
It was great.
Good.
Another question we have comes from Jay. You've mentioned lots of issues. What's the number one issue in Montford today?
Well, I think, I think it's a matter of opinion, right? I think if you like gentrification, then it's a good thing. But if you want to keep a diverse neighborhood, it's not so good. And housing prices are very high. So it's not just relative to Asheville. Well, Asheville's expensive altogether, but Montford is not going to be a place where young couples who are just starting out are going to probably buy their first home unless they have a lot of financial assistance. but like I said, you also see just issues that come up and they're just chipping away and chipping away, like when they tore down all the homes along Broadway, or when they tore down the Coleman House. They built a really out of place restaurant, and then along came the Chamber and built. So, it's not necessarily what happens in your time, it's the precedent. So whenever you make a decision about something in a historic district, you're setting a precedent. So for instance, people want to put up white picket fences. Well, white picket fences aren't, for the time period. But if somebody puts up a white picket fence, then everybody wants to put up a white picket fence. So the Historic Resources Commission would make you take it down.
And we have a question from Carolyn. What happened to the natives who were there initially?
Well, you're going way back. I have no idea what happened to them in any part of Asheville. Whatever happened to Native Americans happened here.
All right, then we have another question from Jay then. Do you think the city's government supports Montford?
Well, I would have an opinion about that, but I don't know if that's everybody's opinion. I think that the Historic Resources Commission was much stronger in the past. And, I don't think that there's as much, I don't know if power is not the right word, but, I don't know. I haven't really been involved in what goes on with the Historic Resources Commission, but from what they tell me, Montford is most of the things that come up on their agenda. So there are 4 local historic districts that they oversee. And if most of their cases are coming from Montford, then there's a problem in the other 3 historic districts.
All right, if we don't have any more questions, then Stacy.
All right, thank you, Destiny. Sharon, thank you so much for coming back today and sharing all of your incredible research about this neighborhood. This was such an incredible experience, and we're really grateful for your time.
Well, you're welcome. I appreciate you asking me. So
we hope that you'll come back again and share some Asheville history with us in the future.
okay, thanks. I just should say, some of this is my perception and not actual, based on my experience.
Absolutely. Thank you guys for joining us today. We hope to see you at our next adult program, History and Highballs, Decorating the Executive Mansion, with special guest First Lady Kristen Cooper. That is taking place virtually on the evening of Thursday, November 30th at 7 p.m. over Zoom. We hope you guys have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you soon. Take care.